There's a moment in every slow burn when you think the hard part is finally behind you. When the walls are down, the kiss has happened, and the man who swore he wasn't capable of this starts proving otherwise. One small, quiet gesture at a time. Freya Ellsworth thought she was there. A rainy kitchen, a kiss that changed the temperature of everything, a man who blocked a number without being asked and showed up every Tuesday like he had something to prove. She was starting to believe him. And then he disappeared. No warning, no explanation. Just silence where Gideon Barlow used to be. If you've ever let someone in and immediately wondered if you'd made a mistake, you already know exactly how this part of the story feels. If this is your first time here, welcome. Freya and Gideon's story starts in part 1, but you can jump right in because this one stands on its own. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. Part 13. Dana hadn't given me details on the phone. Just enough to know it was serious. Just enough to know Gideon had thought of me in the middle of it. And just enough to make the drive to the second location feel longer than the 20 minutes it actually took. The restaurant was called Kindling. Smaller than Embers, same bones, different energy. When I pulled into the parking lot, I could see through the front window that the dining room lights were all on, even though it was a Sunday and they were closed. I sat in my car for a moment. I hadn't been invited exactly. Dana had called, but that wasn't the same as Gideon asking me to come. I got out anyway. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the dining room was empty, but the kitchen beyond it was clearly occupied. Voices, movement, the particular organized chaos of people managing a situation that had gotten away from them. A young woman at the host stand looked up when I came in, uncertain, and I said Gideon's name with enough calm that she nodded and pointed toward the back. I found him in the kitchen office, a small room off the main line, more of a converted storage space with a desk and a whiteboard covered in scheduling grids. He was on the phone, standing, one hand pressed flat on the desk, like he needed the contact with something solid. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and something moved across his face. Relief, I thought, though it was gone quickly, replaced by the focused expression he wore when he was managing too many things at once. He held up one finger. I nodded and waited. The call ended 2 minutes later. He set the phone down and looked at me fully for the first time. He looked tired, in the specific way that comes not from one bad night, but from several. The kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and doesn't shift with coffee. There was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there last Thursday. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Dana called me," I said. "I know," he said. "I asked her to." We looked at each other for a moment across the small office. "What happened?" I asked. He exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. A line cook had been injured during Friday's service. A serious burn, not life-threatening, but bad enough to require hospitalization. The circumstances were complicated. Liability questions were involved. His business partner was flying in from Atlanta, and the staff was shaken in the way kitchen staff get when something goes wrong that was supposed to be prevented. He laid it out factually, the way I'd come to understand he processed things. Information first, emotion somewhere underneath it, accessible only if you knew to look. "Are you okay?" I asked when he finished. He looked slightly surprised by the question, like it hadn't occurred to him that it applied to him too. "I will be," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a second. Then something in his posture shifted, just slightly, just enough. "No," he said. "Not entirely." I crossed the small office and sat down in the chair across from his desk, settling in like I had nowhere else to be. Because I didn't. And because sometimes, the most useful thing you can offer someone is simply not leaving. He watched me do it. And then, slowly, he sat down too. We stayed in that small office for 2 hours. not talking the entire time. That was the thing I kept coming back to afterward, the thing that felt most significant. A man like Gideon, who I'd learned measured every word before he spent it, didn't feel the need to fill the silence, and neither did I. At some point, one of the kitchen staff knocked and asked him something about tomorrow's schedule. He handled it in 3 sentences, door half open, and when he turned back to me, he looked marginally lighter than he had before. Like the act of having someone in the room was doing something the problem-solving couldn't. Around 8, his business partner arrived. A tall man named Garrett who shook my hand with the distracted energy of someone who had just gotten off a plane and had 17 things to resolve before morning. Gideon introduced me without hesitation. Not as his nutritionist, not as a colleague, just my name. And the way he said it was its own kind of statement. Garrett barely registered it, which was fine. He had other things to manage. Gideon and I stepped out of the office to give them room and ended up in the empty dining room, sitting across from each other at a table near the window. The parking lot outside was quiet. The restaurant felt strangely intimate with all its lights on and nobody in it. He ordered food delivered to the restaurant without asking if I was hungry, which by now I understood was his specific language for paying attention. Not asking, just noticing and acting. When it arrived, we ate at that table with the easy quiet of 2 people who had stopped needing to perform comfort for each other. He was still tired, still carrying the weight of the weekend in his posture. But something had loosened since I'd arrived, and I was aware enough of my own feelings to know that I found it meaningful, that I had been the thing that loosened it. After we ate, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Softer than his usual directness. More open, like the exhaustion had worn down some of the careful architecture he kept around himself. "I don't do this well," he said. "Which part?" I asked. "Letting people in when things are hard," he said. "I usually just handle it alone." "I noticed," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm working on it," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. No grand declaration, no promise with a bow on it. Just a man acknowledging a pattern and choosing, quietly, to try something different. I reached across the table and he met me halfway, his hand covering mine, warm and certain, his thumb moving once across my knuckles in a slow, deliberate line that said more than most sentences could. We stayed like that until Garrett knocked on the dining room door, and Gideon had to go back to being the man who had things to manage. But before he stood up, he looked at me one more time and said, quietly, "Don't go yet." So I didn't. I stayed until almost 11. Garrett and Gideon worked through the immediate logistics in the office, while I sat in the dining room with my phone and a second cup of coffee someone had made without being asked. And I thought about how strange it was to feel useful simply by being present. I'd spent 2 years learning to ask for help, from doctors, from my body, from circumstances that didn't negotiate, and somewhere in that process, I'd forgotten that presence itself was a form of giving. That just staying in the room was sometimes the whole thing. When Garrett finally left, Gideon came back to the dining room looking wrung out, but more settled than he'd been 3 hours ago. He sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me with that specific attention of his that I'd stopped trying to deflect. "You stayed," he said. "You asked me to," I said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." That landed somewhere honest. I understood what he meant. Not as an accusation, but as a confession. That he'd asked knowing it was a lot, knowing the timing was terrible, knowing he had no right to expect it, and that some part of him had braced for me not to come through. It occurred to me, sitting there in that empty restaurant under 2 bright lights with the remnants of takeout containers between us, that Gideon Barlow had been let down by people in ways he'd never fully articulated. That the whole careful architecture of self-sufficiency, handling things alone, not asking, not expecting, wasn't just personality, it was protection. I didn't say any of that out loud. Some things land better when they're understood than when they're spoken. Instead, I reached over and stole the last piece of bread from his side of the container, and he watched me do it with something that was almost a real smile. "I'm going to be at Embers Tuesday," he said. "I know," I said. "I'll be there too." He nodded slowly. Then he got up and came around the table and held out his hand to help me up. Old-fashioned and deliberate, completely him. And when I took it, he didn't let go right away. We stood close in the quiet restaurant, his hand warm around mine, and he looked at me the way he had in that rainy kitchen the week before. Like he was still figuring something out, but was less afraid of what he'd find. He lifted his other hand and brushed his knuckles lightly along my cheekbone, slow, barely there, and I felt it everywhere. "Thank you," he said, low and real, "for coming." I nodded, not trusting my voice entirely. He walked me to my car, and at the door he kissed me once, soft, unhurried, with the particular quality of a kiss that isn't trying to start something, but to say something. I drove home with my hand still warm where he'd held it, and I thought, for the first time since moving to Nashville, that maybe starting over didn't have to mean starting alone. What I didn't know yet was that Gideon was about to face something that had nothing to do with a kitchen accident. Something older, closer, and considerably harder to manage than anything that had come before. Tuesday came and he was there, the way he said he would be. That sounds simple. For Gideon, it wasn't, and I was beginning to understand the difference. The second location was still in crisis management mode. Garrett was handling most of it remotely, but the liability questions were unresolved, and the injured line cook was still hospitalized, which meant Gideon was carrying the weight of it even when he wasn't physically there. I could see it in the set of his shoulders when I arrived. Not defeated, he didn't do defeated, but loaded. Like a man running two parallel tracks and refusing to let either one slip. He greeted me the way he always did. Steady, present, a hand briefly at my back as he moved past me toward the pass. Light, familiar, the kind of touch that has stopped needing permission. I sat up at my table, and we fell into the rhythm that had become ours over weeks of Tuesdays and Thursdays. Except that afternoon, around 4, his phone started going. Not constantly, just enough. A call he stepped away for. A text that made his jaw tighten. Another call, shorter, clipped. I kept my eyes on my work and let him manage it, because that was what he needed, and because I'd learned that offering Gideon space was sometimes the most useful thing I could do. But by 5, I could feel the tension in the kitchen had shifted. The staff felt it too, that particular attentiveness that comes when you can tell your chef is somewhere else in his head. After the dinner service got underway and the kitchen found its groove, he came and sat across from me with a coffee he didn't touch and said, without preamble, "My father called." I looked up. He was staring at the table, turning his mug slowly in his hands. "He's sick," he said. "They found something. It's early, treatable, but..." He stopped. I waited. "We haven't talked in 3 years," he said. He wasn't a good father, not in the ways that matter." He said it flatly, without drama, the way you say things you've made peace with on the surface, but haven't fully resolved underneath. I thought about what he'd told me weeks ago at the wedding, fragments about his father, about patterns, about the fear of becoming someone he'd watched hurt people without meaning to. It landed differently now. "Are you going to call him back?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "I've been sitting with it all day and I still don't know." That was honest. I appreciated that he didn't reach for a tidy answer. "You don't have to decide today," I said. He looked up at me then, really looked, the way he did when something got through the careful outer layer. "When things get hard," he said slowly, "I go quiet. I pull back. I've done it my whole life." "I know," I said. "I'm trying not to do that with you," he said. The kitchen moved around us, loud and warm and indifferent, and I reached across the table and put my hand over his. And this time, neither of us moved for a long time. He called his father on a Thursday. He didn't tell me he was going to. I found out the way I'd been finding out most things about Gideon lately, which was through the small shifts in him that I'd learned to read. He came into Embers that afternoon carrying something different. Not heavier, exactly. More like a man who had put something down that he'd been holding for a long time and wasn't sure yet what his hands were supposed to do without it. We worked through the afternoon the way we always did. But around 5, when the kitchen had hit its pre-service rhythm and didn't need him for a few minutes, he came and stood at the end of my table and said, "I called him." I put my pen down. "How did it go?" He thought about it for a moment. "Strange," he said. He sounded old. I didn't expect that. He pulled out the chair and sat, leaning forward with his forearms on the table, a posture I'd never seen on him before. More open, less defended. He apologized, he said. First thing. Before I'd said anything, just, "I'm sorry, Gideon. I know I wasn't there." He shook his head slightly. I didn't know what to do with that. "What did you say?" I asked. "Not much," he said. I listened. I told him I'd think about going to see him. He looked at me. "I don't know if I will," but I told him I'd think about it, and that was more than I thought I could give him. There was something quietly enormous in that. Not resolution, nothing that clean. Just a man choosing to crack a door that had been shut for 3 years, without knowing what was on the other side, because he'd decided that staying shut wasn't working anymore. I thought about my own closed doors, the version of my life I'd had to grieve when the diagnosis came. The career, the plans, the identity I'd built around being someone who never slowed down. I hadn't talked about any of that with Gideon in full, just fragments, offered carefully, but sitting across from him in the warm, late afternoon kitchen, watching him navigate something hard with more grace than he gave himself credit for, I felt the pull to say more. So I did. I told him about the 6 months after the diagnosis, when I'd stopped cooking for myself entirely. When food had become so clinical, so loaded, that I couldn't make a meal without it feeling like a problem to solve, rather than something to enjoy. That coming back to it had been slow and deliberate, and was still, sometimes, a negotiation. He listened the way he always listened, completely still. When I finished, he reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, gentle, unhurried, and let his hand rest briefly against my jaw. "You rebuilt the whole thing," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Still am." He nodded slowly, his thumb tracing a quiet line along my cheekbone before his hand dropped back to the table. "Me too," he said. And it was the most honest thing either of us had said out loud about what was happening between us. Not a declaration, not a promise. Just two people admitting, quietly, that they were both still under construction. And choosing to be that way in front of each other anyway. After service ended and the kitchen went quiet, he walked me out and kissed me in the parking lot, under a sky that had finally cleared after days of cloud. Long and unhurried, his hand at the back of my neck, warm against the cool night air. When he pulled back, he kept his forehead against mine, and I felt him exhale, slow and full, like something releasing. "Stay tomorrow," he said. "Come to the market with me in the morning." I pulled back just enough to look at him. It was such a simple ask, and it meant everything. "What time?" I said. And the way he smiled, really smiled, the kind that reached all the way, was something I knew I was going to remember for a long time. The farmer's market on a Saturday morning is a different world than a restaurant kitchen. And watching Gideon move through it was one of those small revelations that sneak up on you when you're not bracing for anything. He knew the vendors by name. Not in the performative way of someone building a brand, but genuinely, stopping to ask about a daughter who'd been sick, remembering that one grower had switched from conventional to regenerative farming 2 seasons ago, and wanting to know how it was going. He moved slowly, which I hadn't expected. In the kitchen, he was precise and efficient, every movement with a destination. Here, he had nowhere to be, and he seemed to know it. And he let himself take up the morning the way mornings are supposed to be taken, without agenda. I walked beside him and didn't say much, which felt easy in the way that only feels easy with the right person. He'd hand me things to smell or taste without explanation. A variety of apple I didn't recognize. A bunch of fresh thyme that he held close enough that I had to lean in, close enough that his shoulder was against mine, and neither of us adjusted. At one point, he stopped at a stall selling small batch preserves and picked up a jar of fig and black pepper and turned it over in his hands, reading the label with the focus he gave everything. And I watched him do it and thought about how much of a person you can learn from the way they pay attention to small things. He caught me looking. I didn't pretend I wasn't. He put the jar down and looked at me with that expression he'd been letting me see more of lately. The one without the careful architecture around it. Just him. Just what he was actually feeling. "What?" he said. "Nothing," I said. "Just looking." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he picked the jar back up and put it in his bag, and reached over and took my hand as we walked to the next stall. Simple as that. No announcement, just a decision, acted on, in the middle of a Saturday morning with people moving around us and the smell of autumn produce in the air. We ended up at a small coffee stand near the edge of the market, sitting on a low wooden bench with paper cups between our palms, the morning going golden around us. He was quiet for a stretch, the comfortable kind, and then he said, without looking at me, "I think I'm going to go see him, my father." I looked at him. "When?" "Before the end of the month," he said. "I don't know what it'll be, but I think I need to go find out." He turned to look at me then. "I wanted you to know." It mattered that he'd said it. Not because I needed to be informed, but because telling me was itself the thing, the choice to not carry it alone, to let someone else into the weight of it. I put my hand over his on the bench between us. He turned his palm up and held it. We sat like that for a while, the market moving around us, neither of us in a hurry to be anywhere else. After a while, he finished his coffee and turned toward me, and brushed a strand of hair from my face, with a gentleness that made my chest ache in the best way. Then he kissed me, slow and warm and entirely unhurried, one hand curved against my jaw, the morning quiet around us. And it felt like the kind of kiss that isn't a beginning or an ending, but something more honest than both. A middle. A choice made in full knowledge of everything that came before it. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, and I felt him breathe. And I thought about how far both of us had come from the people who had sat across a professional table from each other not so long ago. Two people too careful to want anything. Learning, slowly and imperfectly, that careful didn't have to mean alone. "Same time next Saturday?" he said. I smiled against his cheek. "Same time next Saturday," I said. And that's the end of Freya and Gideon's story, all 3 parts of it. If this journey meant something to you, drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments and let us know how you felt about these 2. Your ratings and comments are what make us keep telling stories like this one. Thank you so much for being here from the beginning, or wherever you jumped in. It means more than you know. We'll see you in the next story.